Yeah, so a few years ago, my cousin was diagnosed with breast cancer. And the good news was that her brother-in-law is a really good oncologist up in Philadelphia. And now he didn't treat breast cancer, but he was able to get her to some of the best doctors on the East Coast. And thankfully, after some trials and tribulations, she's doing really well. And I remember thinking, and I think this is kind of the healthy reaction, man, I hope those doctors are filthy, stinking rich. Like, they've done something amazing. They're helping make saving other people's lives, but making other people's lives better. And I hope they're really rewarded, because that's something very rare and very hard and super valuable. Versus this idea of profiting off the backs of the sick. No, they were profiting by making sick people healthy. And that's something I think is really admirable. But if you think about how we're actually taught to think today, those doctors, they are rigging the system. They're the ones crushing the American dream. They're the 1% exploiting the 99%. Now, they usually don't demonize doctors directly, although if you remember in the run-up to Obamacare, doctors performing unnecessary tests on kids in order to line their pockets, that was Obama's line. So, and even if they don't point to them, even if they usually point to hedge fund managers and CEOs, first of all, I think hedge fund managers and CEOs also do things that are amazing for people's lives, even if it's not literally saving them, although some CEOs, in effect, do that. You have a moral responsibility if you're going to demonize a whole class of people to say, oh, I don't mean those people. If you're going to say the 1% are responsible, then you better say who you mean and who you don't mean. I mean, these kind of blanket condemnations of people, that's one of the things that's so evil about prejudice, right, is when we make these kind of universal judgments. So there's something really wrong, I think, with the way we're taught to think about economic issues, and in particular through the lens of inequality, in that it's really demonizing it demonizes some of the people who are the best, who do the best things for human life, who actually solve problems and make our lives longer and more enjoyable. The economic inequality is an interesting issue, and I think it's important to have a real view, because it's not like, so take healthcare. Healthcare is an important issue, but it's kind of like this narrow issue, and we can have a debate on what the policies are and so on. But economic inequality is actually a framework. It's a framework for how to think about every economic issue, including healthcare. And so if we lose the debate on economic inequality, then we lose the debate on economic freedom. Like, there's no second chances at that point. So we have to have a view. Now, what has been happening in the debate? Have we been just crushing this debate and leaving the left afraid to even talk about inequality? That's not exactly what I've seen. In fact, if you look at polling, historically, Americans have not really cared about economic inequality. And that generally stays pretty stable. But that's started to change. More and more Americans are rating it as something that they're worried about, and more Americans are becoming supportive of proposals to fight it. To fight it by how? By making government smaller and leaving people more free to achieve great things, right? No, by expanding the power of government, and in particular using it to cut down those at the bottom, at the top. Now, why are they winning? Why are the critics of inequality winning this debate? Is it just that Bernie Sanders is like the most charismatic, sex appeal filled guy on earth? No, it's that they have something very powerful in the ideas. There's something really powerful about the ideas. And so to understand the debate, there's two elements you need to understand about the way that they're framing things. That gives them the high ground, and then that makes it very hard for us to control the debate and make any progress. And the two things are, one, they have a moral ideal, and two, they have a powerful narrative that claims to show that when we abide by this ideal, we flourish, and when we abandon the ideal, we flounder. So the ideal, of course, is economic equality. Now, it doesn't mean that they explicitly advocate full equality, but their point is the more we move in that direction, the better, and the further we move away, the worse. And then the historic narrative, you have to have heard some of this, right? It was in the post-war era. It was America's golden age as the government fought for economic equality through high taxes on the wealthy, through strong pro-union laws, through a relatively high minimum wage. And then what happened in the 1970s is we took a radical free market direction. I bet you guys didn't know this, but apparently we became laissez-faire in the 1970s and 80s. And what was the result? 1%, they grab all the gains, they're doing really well, the rest of us are stagnating. And that's the narrative that people hear. So what's been the kind of counterpoint to this? How have we responded? Remember, they have a moral ideal and this powerful narrative that seems to explain how we got to where we are today. The response is really, there's been two kinds of responses from their opponents. So one is quibble over statistics, and two is quibble over means. So quibble over statistics and quibble over means, or solutions. So if you look at kind of almost any op-ed, I was going to say book, but there's literally only been 2 books. So the left every year puts out like 4 or 5 books on economic inequality, giving that same narrative that I just told you in one form or another. How many books have we put out saying that they're wrong? Well, when I started writing my book 2 years ago with Yaron, there were exactly 0. 0. The left have been doing this for well over a decade, and we had nothing to say. Since then, there's been 2. One by a Canadian economics professor who did a pretty good job, but nobody's ever heard of his book. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I'm responsible for selling more copies than he did. And then the second is by Thomas Sowell. And I love Thomas Sowell, but frankly, it was just kind of like, here, let me pull out some pages from stuff I've written in the past that kind of addresses this debate, but really doesn't address a lot of it. Now, Thomas Sowell on a bad day is better than most people on their best day, so I don't mean to criticize him too much. But if you think this is the defining debate of our time, according to the left, why don't we have a flurry of answers? But when we do look for answers, it's kind of like, well, inequality is not as bad as you guys say. You get the statistics a little wrong. Yeah, progress has slowed a little bit, but not as bad as you guys think. So it's this kind of quibbling over statistics. And then the second is quibbling over means. So does anybody remember what Senator Rand Paul said during the presidential debates when he was asked how he would, deal with the charge of economic inequality? He said, guess what? It's Democrats who create more economic inequality. Republicans create less. Now, I want to set aside whether or not these two kinds of claims are true. I mean, definitely, I think the statistics are a whole mess on the inequality debate. And in our book, we try to parse through a lot of them to show how to make sense of all the conflicting claims we hear. But both of these arguments commit the same fallacy, or they have the same shortcoming. And that shortcoming is they both concede that economic equality is an ideal. Both of them grant that at the outset. Yes, we should be trying to equalize as much as possible. The only question is how far away from that are we, and what's the best way to do it? Problem with that is, whatever else you can say about free markets, they do not lead to anything close to economic equality. Nothing close. Why? Well, we'll delve into that a little bit more in a bit, but just right at the outset, we can think people are way more productive than others. People create vastly different amounts of wealth. My wife is a teacher, so even if she's the best teacher in the world, and I'm inclined to think she is, granted I'm biased, she teaches what, a few dozen kids a year? She's providing economic value to a handful of people. Jeff Bezos, he's providing economic value to what, millions of people a day? Yeah, I mean, arguably billions, directly and indirectly. Is there any way they're going to be anything close to equal, or should they be anything close to equal? So if you grant that economic equality is an ideal, you've thrown away the moral high ground for freedom, period. So what do? Well, basically, there's 3 things you have to do, and this is what our book aims to do. So it's 1, you need to challenge their ideal. Number 2, you need to challenge their narrative. And 3, and this is really important because this is where our side almost always falls down, you have to have a counter-ideal and a counter-narrative. And a narrative is not really a good word because it should be true. Like, this is not concoct a really clever story. It's that you need to set the record straight and show that, in fact, that it's our ideal that matters and that explains what's been happening that got us to where we are today. So I can't give you the full case in the next 15 or 20 minutes, but I do want to say a few things about how to think of it. So I think for anybody who values free enterprise, the kind of perspective that you should have in terms of what is the ideal that kind of governs the system is opportunity. Opportunity. And in particular, let's flesh that. It's an open road to productive achievement. It's an open road to being able to make something of your life and to rise as far and as high as your ambition and ability will take you. You can contrast that, say, with a place that some people in this country think is like the amazing ideal, which is Cuba. Right there, most roads are closed to you as an individual. So you can't just decide what business you want to start or what product you want to sell or what you want to create. And even if you do have a job, you face not a minimum wage, but a maximum wage, $20 a month. Unless you guys went there to become doctors, in which case you'll be living large on $30 a month. So you can have that going for you. But no, in America, it's the idea of opportunity, an open road to rise as far as you can, surrounded by other producers who can make that path even easier. So it's that in America, the reason people flee from Cuba to Florida rather than from Florida to Cuba is that here the roads are open and they can work with people like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or become someone like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. They can become first rate at any job they want, whether it is an author, somebody running a small business, maybe a laundry cleaner, carpet cleaner, becoming like a really excellent plumber. There's just the opportunity to do what you want and profit as a result. And you can think, even these kind of small businesses, would you rather be a plumber in America or a plumber in Havana? By the way, we make jokes about plumbers and everything. Plumbers' starting salary is like $40,000, which is not bad, and they can get up to $70,000. So one of the ways in which we've been taught that there's no opportunity for most people in America is that people only focus, like they equate opportunity with financial success. But the fact is, if you're self-supporting and doing something that you're passionate about and that means something to you, that's what I regard as success. So if you show me quintiles and say, oh, look at how many people only move up to the third quintile, isn't that a tragedy? No, if they're doing what they care about. Like I said, my wife's a teacher. If she's in a third quintile, we don't care what quintile. We start off the book with my co-author. He's actually an immigrant from Israel. And he came to America, and he came here because he thought, I want to make the best of my life. I want to go to the place where I'm going to have the most opportunity. The question he didn't ask himself is, man, I hope that doesn't put me into the bottom 10%. Or oh man, I'm going to be in the top 1%. Totally irrelevant. Our focus should be on our own lives, and that shouldn't be comparative. Okay, so opportunity is the ideal that you need to focus on, and opportunity meaning the opportunity to rise by productive achievement. What politically makes that possible? Well, it is equality, but it ain't economic equality, it's political equality. Political equality is kind of what the founding fathers had in mind when they were talking about equality. Equality as an ideal in politics really comes out of the Enlightenment. So pre-Enlightenment, you're dealing with kind of medieval and all the way up to mercantilism, but you're dealing with a world ruled by an aristocracy in which there's these classes that you really can't cross the barrier, right? It's that some people have special privileges by virtue of birth, and other people are faced with special burdens as a matter of birth. So we talk about a rigged system today. That's a rigged system. It's a system where no matter how good you are, no matter how hard you work, nope, you stick in your place. You can't rise. Or, hey, no matter what a loser you are, hey, you have a bunch of people giving you money and working for you, and you can live large by the standards of the day. Of course, the thing that happens when you put people in these categories is you get really poor systems because people aren't actually able to put ideas into action. So political equality is the one that says government treats us all the same. We're all equal in the sense we all have the same rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so black or white, man or woman, rich or poor, the government's going to protect your freedom, your freedom, your freedom equally. Now, of course, to say it's an ideal is to keep it keep in mind we did not fully live up to it, and there are many examples of this. And slavery, of course, is the most obvious, but it was an ideal. It was kind of what we should aspire to be, and to the extent we lived up to it, that's what unleashes opportunity. Because when we are all equally free, nothing can stop us from pursuing our vision of our life, from giving it our best and from achieving the best. So that's kind of then the framework. What happens to economic inequality? Or what happens economically once we're politically equal? Well, I mentioned before this idea, well, we create different amounts of economic value, but let's really work that out. What happens when we're equally free? How does economic inequality actually emerge from people's choices? So who here has read Harry Potter, any of that series? All right. Rowling, of course, as you know, started out basically broke and became basically a billionaire. Now, how did that happen? Did she like round us all up and say, all right, guys, I've had enough of this. I want all your money? Did she bring her book to the government and say, hey, this is a great book? And they said, yes, we are going to give you the good writer subsidy. Here's $1 billion. No. What happened was a bunch of individual, pretty small transactions, right? I went to the store, I handed over $20, and I got a Harry Potter book. And so did millions and millions of other people. Did the same thing. Now, who came out ahead in that? Was it Rowling because she became $20 richer? Obviously, she didn't get the full $20, but you get my point, right? Was she the beneficiary and then I was the loser who was exploited out of $20? Was I the winner because I bilked her out of a book and all she got was this little piece of paper? No, it was win-win, right? I valued the book more than the $20. She and her publishers and Amazon and Barnes & Noble, I don't know why anybody would go to Barnes & Noble when we have Amazon, but nevertheless, like they value the $20 more than the book. So what happened to inequality, though, in that scenario? It increased, right? Because she's now a billionaire. And the rest of us were, depending on how many books we bought, say $100 poor. So inequality increases, but we all got better off as a result. We got better off because these were voluntary decisions. So one of the things that we're often asked is, hey, is Joe Schmo worth $100,000, or is he worth $1 million, or is J.K. Rowling worth $1 billion? That is always the wrong question, because there's nobody who's forced to give Rowling $1 billion. Indeed, nobody gives Rowling $1 billion. It's that each of us face a question in any given transaction. Is this transaction to my interest? Not is Rowling worth $1 billion, but is Rowling's book to me worth $20? Other people's net worth, this may come as a shock. If you listen to our president or many other people, it's none of your business. Other people's net worth is none of your business. But nevertheless, if we take that kind of big picture perspective, inequality, when it emerges through the free voluntary decisions of individuals, is win-win. It's completely irrelevant. Whether it's really big or really small, who cares? What you want is the freedom for all of us to write the books we want to write and to buy the books we want to buy. And the same principle applies in every other field. And so in the debate over economic inequality, what you always want to be clear on is, okay, are these people saying that this rich guy got rich by taking advantage of others, by exploiting them, by using force to get win-lose rich? Or was it voluntary? Was it the result of creating values that led to win-win wealth and prosperity? So if that's how people become unequal under freedom, how do we make them more equal? Let me just check the time right here. So how are they going to become more equal? Well, I'll tell you a story about two brothers. Is this going to go on the internet?
Yeah, it'll be up.
Okay, then I won't tell you there. So two brothers, I'm going to be kind of mean to one of them, but he kind of deserves it. So they were both pretty smart. Like, this is not an issue of intelligence. They were both pretty smart guys. But one of them decided at a very early age, they grew up in a pretty small town, and one decided when he was in middle school, I do not want to be here my whole life. I want to do something bigger, more exciting, make a lot of money, have a lot of success, just live on my own terms. I don't want to be, if you've ever lived in a small town, a lot of people kind of get in this trap of, well, I'll just do what my parents do, and they're not that ambitious, and he was. So he wasn't like your cliche, I'm always studying or anything. He knew how to party and still does. But he took his work seriously and he took his life seriously and he worked really hard. He had to work his way through college because his parents didn't have a ton of money, and eventually got into a good college, and there was a struggle to get his first job, but once he did, that just became his total focus. He was completely focused on it, and today he's not a millionaire by any means, but he's very successful. Okay, brother number two. Never really made a plan for his life. Did okay in school, not like a complete slacker, but just, whatever it takes not to get in trouble with mom and dad. Go to college, it's not really for me. didn't have kind of ambition plan, dreamed of getting rich quick, so would read like, like how to get rich in 33 days or whatever, but never really executed a long-term plan. And so ended up being a manager at kind of a service, fast food type place. And when he did get money, just boom, spent it really fast on, big screen TVs or whatever the case may be, but lots of credit card debt. Okay, so we have this scenario. We have one brother who, let's say, has a net worth. I'm just making this up because I don't know the exact numbers. One has a net worth of 500,000. One has a negative net worth of 50,000. So how are we going to equalize? Well, basically, we could just take a whole bunch of money from successful brother and give it to unsuccessful brother. Or, if we're feeling really ambitious, we can bash brother number one over the head and then figure their outcomes will end up being quite the same. In one way or another, though, the serious point is you have to use compulsion. You have to use physical force. And you have to use it in one particular way, to penalize somebody the more they achieve and to reward somebody the less they achieve. That's how you equalize. You penalize achievement and you reward lack of achievement. Now, there's kind of a word that contains this, economic equality. That's what the ideal of economic equality means. Economic equality means that to the extent we pursue that ideal, we're penalizing people for their achievements, for the things that their virtue has earned them, and we're rewarding them for their failure to do that. Sometimes that failure is for reasons we can be sympathetic with, right? Like people do hit on bad luck, but it also gets rewarded for their own immoral choices. So if a person makes himself into a loser who doesn't achieve anything, he's just as entitled to the rewards of the successful as somebody who hit on hard times through no fault of their own. That's the ideal. So that's what I mean about exposing their ideal. Exposing their ideal of economic equality as immoral means showing that it's the complete inversion of justice. Justice is supposed to be, if you do the right things, you get good rewards, and if you do the wrong things, you get punishments, right? Or certainly you don't get rewarded. And economic equality is an ideal, or social justice, as they call it. If you add social to something, it really just means I want to redefine something to kind of fit, my emotions. But social justice is just, one way to think about it is real justice is you punish people for the wrong they've done to others. And social justice is you punish people who haven't done anything wrong in order to reward people who have not been wronged. So that's their so-called ideal. Another way to think about it is imagine you run a business. And let's just to make this easy, you have 3 salesmen. One brings in $1 million a year. The other 2 bring in $100,000. Now, you're not like a crazy communist, so you're not going to fully equalize the rewards, right? But you just want to make things more equal. So you say to your best salesman, I'm going to take 50% of what you earn, and I'm going to give it to these other 2 guys. 2 questions. Number 1, how is that fair? And number 2, what do you think is going to happen to the business? Any wild guesses? Like, all right, I'll tell you the answer. They're not going to succeed. But that's what the inequality critics want to do to the country. And they think that somehow this will revive the American dream. That if we just punish the people who epitomize the American dream enough, things will be awesome for everybody. And I think just intuitively that doesn't make sense. But then let's turn to the final point I want to make, which is, okay, well, what has actually happened if we look at history? Is it true that the way we got here today is that we had this golden age of fighting economic inequality, and now we have the dark ages of letting economic inequality get out of control? So the key place in the book, we talk about this A in chapter 2 and B in chapter 5. So I'm just going to highlight one aspect of our answer. The reason that the inequality critics' narrative resonates is that many of the problems today they point to are real. Sometimes exaggerated, but real. But they totally get wrong what the causes of our problems. So people do have the sense of America's not as opportunity rich as it once was. We're not seeing as much progress at the rate that we once did. There do seem to be people who are becoming successful for reasons not of merit, but of something else. There does seem to be a way in which the system is becoming rigged. And there's a way in which they're right. But it's not economic inequality. It's political inequality. We have a political inequality problem in this country. So remember, let's remember how we got here. Political equality, protect everybody's rights equally. No special privileges, no special burdens, restrictions, or penalties. Everybody's treated the same. Does that describe what we've seen in the last 40 years, let alone, I mean, really the last 100 plus? Have we just been all equally free to pursue our happiness? No, we've seen just massive amounts of special privileges for some and special burdens and penalties for others. I'm just going to rattle off a few just to give us the flavor. So on the special privileges side, there's no doubt you've heard about the issue of cronyism, right? I mean, we lived through 2008 and we saw bailouts for bankers, bailouts for automakers, really bailouts for unions. But it's basically, hey, guess what? You regular folk, if you go out of business, tough nuggets. If you guys have political influence, aha, we'll take care of you. We'll bail you out. Too big to fail is a related example of that and even contributed to the 2008 crisis, right? But it's not just the, quote, rich, not just crony businessmen who get special privileges. What is the entire welfare state, but some people get to consume without working, at least to that extent, and other people get to work without getting the rewards? Special privilege, hey, here's a check for something you didn't earn. Special burden or punishment, hey, you get to work so that other people can go on vacation or buy whatever they want to buy. I mean, what is socialized medicine except for, hey, we're going to impose a bunch of bureaucratic controls on doctors and hospitals and insurers so that other people can say, hey, you get to save my life, but only if I get to dictate how you practice your job. So political inequality. On this, let's focus on some examples of the kind of special penalties and special burdens. The minimum wage. So what does the minimum wage say? The minimum wage says, I live in California, and so it looks like we're going to go to $15 an hour minimum wage. So that means if I can't find anybody to pay me $15 an hour, let's say I don't have a lot of experience, I don't have a great education, I'm trying to make something in my life, but man, I have to start at the bottom. Guess what? It's illegal for me to work if I can't find somebody to pay me at least $15. The government is telling me it's illegal for me to have a job. Everybody, you guys get to have a job. You went to nice schools. You know, you got a great education. You built up some skills and so on. So you get to work. But me, who's starting from nothing, who desperately needs to work in order to meet my basic needs, no, it's illegal for me to work. I basically have to rely on handouts. That's what the minimum wage does. Occupational licensing. So let's say I can't find anybody to pay me $15 an hour. Maybe I'll start a business. I'm really good at hair braiding, let's say. So I'm not, but I'm sure one is good at it. So I'm going to go out and just like braid hair for a living. Not so fast. It doesn't matter whether there's people willing to pay me to do the job and whether I can do the job, because in most states, I have to go through special training that costs money and costs time. But the whole problem is I don't have money and I don't have time. So, bam, can't work there. And if I want to actually, I mean, in some states, if I want to teach other people how to hair braid, in some states, I have to go through more hours of certification than even an EMT. So special restrictions that are preventing me from pursuing my happiness. And these are really countless. We take up something like 10 or 20 pages just cataloging a number of the ways in which we moved in the direction of greater and greater political inequality. And that, not economic inequality, is really the defining challenge of our time and the explanation for why people have this sense that the game is becoming rigged. But, and this is the last point I want to talk about, and then we'll open up for questions. Let's see. Oh, perfect. So who's doing the rigging? Like, what are we told? Who's the ones rigging the game? The 1%, right? So it's based on your economic status. Good, he was listening, because I actually said that like in the first 2 minutes of this talk. No, so it's the 1%. They're rigging the game. So it's the people with these high incomes. Now, does that, I mentioned is it the doctors working 90-hour weeks to solve people's medical problems, who's in his spare time, aha, I shall rig the system? Is it even hedge fund all right, so anytime anybody critiques hedge fund managers for you, you have to ask them how many hedge fund managers they know and what they even do. And all right, hedge fund manager is kind of a tricky thing. The next time they tell you that CEO pay is out of control, ask them, what do CEOs do? Yeah, that's exactly what their response will be. We're taught to have very strong feelings about these things, but we have no idea what the jobs actually involve and whether they're crucial, whether they're easy. So this is kind of your key back pocket tip. Just say, well, what do they do? And bam, all right, you win argument. So, but who is rigging it? Now, some of the people are rich, right? It's not like it's a bunch of poor people rigging things. But it's not the rich. The rich is a lousy concept because it packages together people who get rich through productive achievement and want to be free to achieve with people who get rich by picking other people's pockets, usually through Washington or their local, their local government. No, the system is being rigged by and for a politically influential ruling class. That is, and this is both parties, so this is not a partisan point. It's a politically influential ruling class that wants control over other people's choices and other people's wealth. They're the ones who want to regulate every aspect of our lives because they think that they know how best we should live our lives. The inequality alarmists are just one little clique within the ruling class. And basically what they want to do is change the game, not so that it's not rigged, but so that it's rigged with them having the power and allegedly in the name of the 99%. But really what they want to do is they want to rig it in the name of the unproductive against the productive. And productive means whatever your income. If you're ambitious and poor, the system's going to be rigged against you. Again, you can't get that first job because there's now $15 minimum wage. Or by the time they're done, right, like $100,000 minimum wage. It is rigged against or for the unproductive, and that includes the unproductive poor, but man, does it include the unproductive rich. Because I'll tell you, the inequality critics will be very happy to get paid very handsomely to fight inequality. Now, that's not their worst sin. I would much rather that they were rich and just stopped trying to fight economic freedom. But it is worth pointing out that they do quite well for themselves. Because what they're alarmed by is not economic inequality. It's not actually the money that is at issue for them, and it's certainly not helping other people gain more money. What they're really about is stopping people's ability to rise by their own effort and by crushing the system that liberates people to rise by their own effort. So if you do that, if you expose their immoral alleged ideal, if you expose as hopeless their narrative, and if you have a powerful ideal that you stand for and a narrative to back it up, that's how you turn the tables on the inequality critics. So with that, any questions you have, I'd love to hear them. Yes?
And
Oh,
we don't have a microphone for those guys?
oh, that's right.
Do you now? Yeah, we do.
That's cool. I mean, I can repeat a question, too.
Because that one, he can't move around.
Yeah, this was the one that was supposed to be on you, and then the other one was going. But let's just
But it's
let's
right
just
here.
repeat.
Yeah, it's fine. I'll repeat it. I'm pretty good at summarizing these in clever ways anyway. So yeah, you go first.
So you're speaking about politically influential versus economically influential. How do you counter the point that money is political power?
Yeah. So the question is that I'm talking about the political versus the economic, and the point that we're often told is, hey, money is power, right? And money is power. That is, if you have money, you can get things done. But there's a fundamental distinction between political and economic power. So political power is I get to coerce you. I get to force you. I get to take stuff from you or stop you from doing what you want. Economic power is I get to offer you a reward, and if you don't want it, you get to go the other way. I'm expanding the options available to you. And this is true whether I'm Don Watkins, who barely has 20 bucks in his pocket, or whether I'm Google, who can offer you a $100,000 job. I can expand your options and leave you free to go your own way. Now, it's true that economic power can when you have a system of political inequality, it can allow you to buy more influence and gain political power over people. But the problem is not the money. The problem is that we have political inequality. We have the ability to buy power. So it's like saying, hey, we have this problem where the government is using arbitrary force against others, and people are using the money that they justly earn to control that force. Let's stop people by taking away their justly earned money. That's just stupid. That's the stupidest argument I've ever heard. No, what you do is you separate economic and political power and say political power can be used to protect people's equal freedoms, and economic power, hey, more power to you. Yes?
Hi. So as a CEO of a startup and a former objectivist, I certainly agree that non-arbitrary inequality is good, justified, moral, fine. But unfortunately, a lot of Ayn Rand supporters nowadays seem more intent on justifying currently existing markets rather than delegitimizing inequality that is caused by a mixed market system. And a perfect example of why economic power is fungible to political power is where I live currently, which is Silicon Valley.
Uh-huh.
And Peter Thiel, supposed objectivist and an ally of all sorts, is able to directly coerce through the fungibility. He's able to be the largest contractor of the National Security Association through Palantir. And it's a running joke among the Valley that Google is becoming the government, Google government.
Okay.
So I think it's
What's the question?
The question is, good point. What can we do to make objectivists more rhetorically clear?
Uh-huh.
Maybe avoid some of the what people see as a justification of a currently existing system, and rather justifying laissez-faire, which is the goal, the ideal.
So I think, yeah, you definitely, so if you didn't hear the question, he's basically saying that there's this problem, which is that instead of just getting the principles really clear about how to think about economic inequality, there's this tendency to defend the inequalities that we see today, even if they actually emerge from kind of unjust activities and benefiting government. And I think I think that there can be that tendency, and it is a difficult trap to fall into. But that's why your focus has to be, you have to be able to separate out two things. Number one is, what are the principles by which we distinguish justly earned incomes from unjustly ones? And that, I think, is the first and most important key. That has to be priority number one. What are the principles that we're actually going by? And then there's the second question of how do we judge things that are going on today? And that can be tricky because there's two difficulties. One is just getting the facts right. So for instance, I've read Peter Thiel's book and really like him, but I don't know that much about his actual business. And so if we had a discussion, you would be throwing out all these things about me and I wouldn't quite know what to make of them and so on. So it would be a hard discussion. But then the second thing is that even when people are mixed, right? So we can say, all right, there's this mixture. Somebody got some money some good ways and some money some bad ways, and it's hard to pull it apart. What kind of overall evaluation we should give them? And that's kind of a second thing that makes it difficult. But the main thing that you have to do is just be objective with people and say, look, this is the way in which we need to think about it, and then let's have a discussion about trying to apply it to today, but that can be really difficult and there can be honest disagreements about how to do it. But certainly, we shouldn't feel invested in proving that any particular individual, earned his wealth if he didn't, or if he didn't fully do it, because nothing hinges on that. What hinges on, something hinges on that, but in terms of the overall debate, what you're concerned with is what are the principles that we're working by. What the critics of inequality do is the opposite, is they try to blur that. They try to stop talking about what principles we should use and start talking about concretes and being really unclear about the principles. So they like to focus a lot on, here's a guy who got where he did by exploitation. And then you ask them, well, it's like, oh wait, so is the problem the inequality that emerged from the exploitation? Or would the exploitation be okay if it made things more equal? They want to make that unclear because their principles are evil. You want to make the principles clear if yours are good. So that's the best answer I can give you briefly, but you're pointing to a real challenge. Yes?
Hi, so I'm from New York, so I have a ton of very progressive friends that often, use the same narrative that you've been, referring to. And I find that a lot of times they kind of seem stuck in this, the fixed pie kind of fallacy that one has to earn at the expense of another.
Uh-huh.
Do you find in your experience that addressing that is a fallacy helps the argument, that one does not need to benefit necessarily by taking away from people
Yeah, so the question is, so she talks to a lot of people who are critical of inequality, and there's kind of an underlying view of wealth as this fixed pie, and can you and do you need to challenge that? And I think, yeah, definitely. In fact, that's one of the first things we do in the book. So there's kind of this default assumption that they make, and there's actually two related assumptions that they make about wealth that they don't usually explicitly argue for, but that are running in the background that cause economic equality to seem like an ideal. So one is the fixed pie idea, so that for you to gain, I have to lose. And they'll even, use the pie analogy, like, look, they grabbed a big piece of the pie, so there's less for us. And so it makes somebody getting richer seem inherently exploitative. All right, and then the second thing they do, and this is related, is they talk about wealth as if it were a group pie. The 1% grabbed a bigger chunk of our wealth. So it's like we all cook up this giant pie together, and they're taking more. Whereas if you put it in the actual terms that this comes up in reality, which is, hey, those guys over there created more wealth than me and my friends. That's bad. Like, that's way less plausible. So you have to boil down you can't let them, you have to challenge those assumptions explicitly, and then you have to be very sensitive to when they're bringing in through the back door through the way they use language. And so if you think about it this way, why do those two assumptions lead to viewing economic equality as an ideal? Well, they'll even give this kind of examples. Hey, imagine somebody came and there's 4 of us sitting around a table and they dumped $100,000 on the table. How should we divide it? What's the fair way to divide it? Yeah, everybody gets 25%. Like, we divide it equally. Yeah, but guess what? That's not how an economy works. Think about it. We all came in here with different amounts of money in our wallets. What's the right way to divide it evenly? We all pour it in the table and we all get equal parts? Well, that might be really good for the people in here who are broke, but really, really bad for the people who came in here with, their rent money. No, if you keep in mind that individuals produce wealth, then there's no presumption of equality and therefore no suspicion if you see economic inequality. So yeah, it's vital to challenge, and you just challenge it by pointing, breaking down what's going on in really individual terms, and not allowing these kind of group language and this subtle way of treating wealth as a pie. Wealth is not distributed. It's created and traded among individuals, and the only way it can be distributed is somebody comes along and grabs it in the first place. So, yes?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Watkins. I really love your talk, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. I'm wondering if you address the issue of happiness, I guess, because the people I talk to that I disagree on this, they don't point to economic equality as the ideal, they point to happiness. And they say that a minimum economic equality, like welfare state, is the best means to get to the most happiness for the most people. And then they point to the Scandinavian countries and say that they're happier and they improve it. So if you were talking to someone like that, how would you address that situation?
Well, so the question is about happiness and is this economic inequality at odds with happiness? Yeah, I mean, we address it in various ways, but there's basically 10 different fallacies wrapped up in what you just said. Not that you committed them, but that they commit them. I mean, first of all, one of my good friends who I work with is from Sweden, and he will tell you that it's absolutely laughable that Swedes are, happier than most Americans. So those happiness studies are basically self-reporting on how satisfied you are with life, which, by the way, doesn't really have a lot to do with genuine happiness. But B, culturally, different cultures have different views about how happy you should be. And so my co-author is Jewish, so I can say this because he always says this, that if you poll Jews, the happiest Jew is going to tell you how miserable he is. And if you poll Swedes, the most miserable Swede is going to tell you how brilliantly happy they are. So a lot of it is cultural. So what makes you happy is fundamentally a philosophic question. We focus on one aspect of it, which is the central requirement of happiness is living a self-supporting, self-directing life. That is, you have control of your life because you create the resources that you need to live, and you guide your life by figuring out what is going to be long-range good for me, or what's going to be good for me over the long range. And it's running the course of your life by your mind and by your own effort. And their whole idea is, hey, no, we're going to make you happy by telling you how to live and taking your stuff. So I don't think that's very plausible, and everything else is just about concocting a rationalization for the idea of, hey, the old dictator said we're going to sacrifice you for the sake of the people. This new view is that we're going to sacrifice you for the sake of you. It's equally as evil, but maybe a little more dumb. So, yes.
There are a lot of people that are okay with economic inequality, but not okay with healthcare inequality.
Mhm.
And they think that at a very basic level, that just by virtue of everyone living in this country, they deserve some level of healthcare. And I suppose like you could argue from principle that like no one has a right to anybody else's labor, but I don't think those arguments are particularly effective with most people.
Sure.
So how would you address that argument?
Yeah, so he raised the issue of healthcare inequality and pointed out rightfully, so the typical response from supporters of free markets, and it's not that this response is not wrong, and it's important, but it's not fully persuasive. It's the response that basically says, hey, you don't have the right to my labor, whether I'm a doctor, whether I'm the taxpayer forced to pay for it. The key thing that you need to do is differentiate two things, which is helping people and entitlement. Helping people and entitlement. So think about yourself, and this is what I say to people. I say, all right, you're sick. You need help. You can't afford the surgery that you need. You go over to your neighbor's house. Do you A, knock on the door and just go, hey, you pay for my health care, you jerk. I need it. And if you don't, I'm going to take your car. Or two, do you ask and say, hey, Joe, can you help me out? Like, I hit on tough times. Well, most people, I've never met anybody who goes, well, definitely column A. But then I ask, and be honest with yourself, because this is important. Ask, if Joe said, look, I can't. I'm trying to send my kid to school. I'm trying to pay my mortgage. I just can't afford to right now. I have other priorities. Would you resent him and view him as a villain? Or would you say, all right, well, I'm going to have to keep looking? That's the difference between asking for help and entitlement. One of the ways we pursue our happiness is helping the people and causes we care about. So like, for instance, now luckily my cousin and her husband are very successful, but do you doubt for 1 second that if they weren't and needed help to pay for that doctor, that me and every other person in my family wouldn't have done everything within our power to help them out? Yeah, of course we would. You think her friends and family and neighbors would have pitched in? Yeah, of course they would. But that's very different from the idea of the very fact of my need entitles you to my help. When help is voluntary, when we help each other out voluntarily, then guess what? It's non-sacrificial. We help the people and causes we care about to the extent that we value them. When the government makes need an entitlement, then what you get is you basically divide society into burdens and resources. You're a burden if you're in need, and you're a resource that society is going to exploit if you're not in need. That is an inhuman way to run a society. You don't treat people as burdens and you don't treat people as resources. You treat them as independent individuals. And guess what? Individuals who have self-esteem don't view other people as having a duty to take care of them, as having a duty to reach in their pockets. So one thing about the way I approach that, and that's not the whole issue, but that's one important aspect, is you personalize it, but always put the person you're talking to not in the position of do you want to help people, put them in the position of you're the one who needs help. Because a healthy person does not walk around feeling entitled. And changing that framework will dramatically reframe how they are thinking about the issue and feeling about the issue. Yes?
You give the example of that hair braider and how like government should intervene with like preventing someone. What would you say to like someone who's practicing medicine and they just like, think they can practice medicine or something like that, where there's a little more real consequences? Do you think government has a role to limit someone from doing something like that where there should be real consequences?
Yeah, so I mentioned occupational licensing and went from the hair braiding. I raised the hair braiding example, and he pointed to the healthcare example. So I would say that they're the same phenomenon, but there's two different aspects. So one is you can just point to how crazy and insane it is, and people get that, right? Like the hair braiding thing. But as you pointed out, with healthcare, there's different consequences. And so that needs a little bit more argument. So I'm against all occupational licensing enforced by government. I don't think that's the first thing we need to attack. I do think we could loosen the reins in healthcare quite a bit. Like, I think nurse practitioners could be able to do way more than they're currently allowed to do that would lower costs and give people better service, things like that. But the case for abolishing occupational licensing is actually more complex. So in this book, I don't think to win the inequality debate, we need to argue for getting rid of all occupational licensing. That's not the point. But if you're a champion of laissez-faire capitalism like I am, you do. And there, the basic issue is who gets to set the standards. And if the standards are set voluntarily, like we have private certification companies, for instance, and I'm only going to go to, let's call it USA Medicine, doctors who are USA Medicine certified because, I want to make sure I'm not getting a quack. Then that's great, and we can have competing people giving certifications and so on. But the question is this: if I decide that I want to go to a quack, does somebody else have a right to stop me? And I don't think so. And in part, it's because who has the right to judge who's a quack and who's not? If you look at how occupational licensing actually evolved in the United States, it's kind of a complex story, but it was basically, there was kind of competing views about what good medicine was, and we didn't really have great science, but one side was able to get its approach to medicine embodied in law, and the other side lost out. Now, I happen to think in that particular case, the better side mostly won out, not 100%, but overall. But nevertheless, that was an accident of history. It could have just easily been the quacks who had won that debate. And to get licensed, you have to do, what is it called? Homeopathy or whatever. It's, yeah, homeo lies. But once you allow a certain ideological viewpoint to get enforced by law, then we become the victim of accident, whether that viewpoint is true or false. And so with the FDA, for instance, a lot of what we get is medicines that are perfectly safe by the standards, say, of Europe, who Americans are dying because they're not allowed to get access to, or they're dying because they can't afford because it had to go through a 10-year process that drives up costs. So what you have to do with people is get across the way in which we can deal with the genuine challenge of how do we make sure we're safe, and B, point to the way in which we become less safe when the government gets to dictate what ideas are embodied in law, and so what medicines we can use and who we can go to for our health services. Yes?
So if somebody says, like, there's been a massive redistribution of wealth from the 1% to the 99%, like, the 1% are screwing up the country. Like, if you have, like, two sentences to, like, tell why that's untrue, what would you say?
If I have one or two, that's like,
I guess it just that, like, I guess it seemed like that you're basically saying you have to differentiate in the 1%. It's not all bad. There's some that are unambitious that use the political means.
Yeah, I mean,
ambitious that use the economic means.
Yeah, so the question is basically like, how do I condense everything I said into what's the essence of the answer? And the essence of the answer is that the country is not being destroyed by people prospering from achieving too much. It's being destroyed by people who are stopping us from prospering and by limiting our achievements. That's the central perspective to bring to this debate is productive achievement. That one of the ways in which all of us across all issues are taught how to think about issues is from a consumer-oriented perspective. And what you need to do, if you value freedom and markets and opportunity, is think from a producer perspective. So for instance, the debate over healthcare should not have fundamentally been a debate about patients. It should have been a debate about the freedom of doctors and hospitals, about the people who are actually providing these values that we don't find in nature. Somebody has to create them, somebody has to achieve them, and you have to ask, what are the requirements for them achieving them? And the requirement is not that you have Dr. Obama dictating how our system is functioning. It's that the producers are free to decide the terms under which they work. Is that good for consumers? You bet it is. But it's the right of the producer to determine under what terms he'll work that should be the fundamental consideration. And I think this is with the welfare state. All right, is the welfare state good or bad for poor people? No, the question is the welfare state good or bad for somebody who wants to produce his way to success? We should view each other as traders, again, not as burdens and resources. And a trader, whether he's rich or poor, benefits from other traders being free to pursue their own happiness. So it's just always taking a production perspective rather than a consumption perspective. And then you integrate it with the consumption perspective. Because so there's two kinds of consumers. There's the producer who's now in his role as a consumer, right? So for instance, like yesterday, I basically spent most of the day consuming, which is sitting around and watching TV. But I could do that because I was able to pay for my computer because I'm a producer, because I was able to pay for my hotel room, or actually You guys paid for my hotel room, but or no, actually, you guys paid for my hotel room. The Benjamin Rush Institute, yeah, they paid. So in that sense, I was being a parasite. But no, but I earned that by being a speaker. But okay, next question. Yes.
Kind of building off the earlier question relating things to healthcare, it's kind of deemed immoral to let people suffer. Like one of the most basic human emotions is empathy for people that are in pain, and of course, as physicians, we all want to minimize that. Preventative care, it's been thought, can keep people from reaching that level of suffering, as well as potentially costly intervention is required. So is there potentially a role for, in your mind, government to be involved in programs that could result in savings down the road, or is that still the role of individuals that are their friends, family, community, what have you, to provide those services?
Yeah, so there's a question about preventative care and its potential to actually lead to overall cost savings down the road, and therefore is there a role for government to get people to do it, or should that be left up to the voluntary? So one is just, it's interesting, if I were from almost any other free market think tank, my answer would be, well, if we actually look at the studies, preventative care actually doesn't save money on the whole, because it might for any given individual, but when everybody's going and getting all these preventative care, the overall cost of that is greater. And that's all true. But that's not the right perspective. That's certainly not the moral perspective and not the first question. The question is, like, okay, why does the government get to decide what kind of health care I have and what kind of health care you offer? Like, you just gave me, a good short argument. Hey, guess what? Your life might be better if you go get checkups. And if my physician does that, and if he convinces me, that's great. All right, that's fine. But the question is cost savings to whom? Because the reason why all of these decisions get talked about in collective terms is because we've collectivized the decision making. We've basically made the government responsible directly or indirectly for well over 50% of all healthcare spending. And so then it becomes a collective decision about, hey, is it good for society what Joe does, or what Alex does, or what Don does with his healthcare decisions? Well, I think that's really dangerous, because notice, for instance, the debate about new drugs. You have doubtlessly heard, these questions about, wow, is it even good that we're inventing these new expensive drugs that can, what was the recent one? Was it hepatitis, where they have a really expensive cure for hepatitis? And this, to me, this is the biggest indictment of a collectivized healthcare system. That, is this good for society to have this cure? Like, think of how much it's going to cost society. If you have something that's as amazing as a cure for something as disastrous as hepatitis, and there's a potential view of, oh, this is how tragic, you've gone wrong somewhere. If each of us were responsible for our own healthcare needs, then there'd be no downside, right? Like, it would be either you can afford it, in which case, great, you've cured yourself and left everybody else no worse off. Maybe you have to get help from friends, or you have insurance or something that will cover it. If it's collectivized, it's, oh my God, Joe cured his hepatitis. How are we going to pay the bills this month? Like, how corrupt is that you're like regretting people saving their lives? What you want is individuals responsible for their own healthcare choices, and then they're the ones who are economizing based on their values. So for instance, I might think, yeah, I might financially be better off if I went into the doctor every year and went through these tests and so on, but I have better uses for my money, and I'm willing to accept those risks, and I should be free to do that. But guess what? I shouldn't be free to then leave you with the bill if I come down with something I should have caught. And that's the thing. Collectivism makes us responsible for other people's choices, and what that means is that the responsible people aren't free to make choices that are best for their lives. They get held down to the level of the irresponsible people. And the irresponsible people don't have to pay for the consequences of their irresponsibility. And that's the complete, again, this is a variation of the theme I was talking about, which is that the critics of free markets are really inverting justice. They want to reward people for doing the wrong thing and penalize people for doing the right thing. Anything else? Yes?
I'd like to make a statement and have you point out the fallacy of my statement.
All right. But if you say everything true, I'm not going to make anything up.
Okay. You have the financial means to choose the, I'm going to say, level of health care that you would like to choose to meet your needs. For whatever reason, I do not have the financial means, and I choose to use a government program to receive the care that I need. In so doing, I accept the regulatory oversight that is attached to that. But I still have freedom of choice, or maybe I lost my freedom of choice by, who knows, for whatever reason, I'm compelled to choose a program that's available to me and within my means, whereas you can choose something that I can't. Is there a moral dilemma there?
Well, who's paying for it?
Oh, the government, which would be taxpayers.
So me.
Okay.
So let's take the government out of it. Do you have the right to force me to come over here and reach in my pocket? I mean this. Do you have the right to take my money to go get the health care that you want?
Me personally, no. But
So if you get a bunch of friends together and you gang up on me, then do you have the right to do it? What if you raise your hands first and take a vote, and I only get one vote and you get a vote?
you choose to be a member of this family, and we have decided that we're all putting a certain number of our pennies in the pot to help somebody who needs help. And you choose to be here, and that's a collective agreement, and you chose to make that contribution to help the needy.
Yeah, so I'm glad we got to the crux of the issue. There's two perspectives about what a society is. There's the collectivist perspective, which basically says we're one big giant family and that I don't have the right to live an independent life on my own terms if the family doesn't like it. That the family gets to set the terms and I get one voice out of hundreds of millions. And then if I disagree with the family, they get to pull a gun and tell me how to live. The other is the individualist view that says society is a collection of free, independent, sovereign individuals, and that we can interact voluntarily or go our separate ways, but we don't get to gang up on each other and act like brutes dictating to other people how to live. And what we see if we actually look out at the world is that the more collectivized societies are not the societies where people get the health care they need. There's societies like Cuba and North Korea. And the more individualistic societies are the ones where people prosper pursuing their own independent happiness. There's a lot to say about why I think collectivism, including in any dose, is immoral and destructive. But it's important to keep in mind that's what the debate comes down to. It's, do you view society as a collective endeavor in which you are owned by the group? Or do you view your life as yours free and clear, and you don't have some debt that you have to repay just because you happen to be born? And so I definitely take the individualist view, and then I reject the collectivist view. And I wasn't trying to be like hostile to you. I thought you were raising good questions, but what I was trying to show is that you have to have the self-esteem to let people who challenge you from a collectivist view know that, no, I do not believe you have a right to my money or a right to my services. You can ask for them, and then that becomes a question of help and benevolence. But if you're demanding them, that's the same as if a thug came up in the street and said, give me your wallet. Or, a more common occurrence, even a bum who comes up and says, hey, can you spare $1, but is getting kind of in my face and pressuring me. Both of those I regard as completely illegitimate. And no, I have no sympathy for that kind of behavior. So, yes.
And I'm sorry, we're trying to locate your books. They were supposedly shipped here Monday and Tuesday, so you can sign them.
All right.
But the hotel cannot find them. So Joe's working on it.
Bernie Sanders is sneaking around back there, like, ha ha.
So I'm sorry. So that was just to say, I'm sorry if you actually covered this, but there's part of what we were talking about before your talk was if we can help have better thinking methods about problems, that is going to be, that's going to make more progress than trying to convince anybody of a single point.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the concepts that you deal with in your book, and I don't remember exactly how you did, but it's that idea of what the package dealing, where you have a concept that in part has something that is real and good,
Mm-hmm.
but the way that concept is bundled also sneaks in something that feels good but really isn't. And there's something about, and I can't remember, there's something about this whole the way that inequality debate has been set up, that includes one of those ideas?
Well, it's all over the place. So the question is really about, so I come from this from the perspective of philosophy. Let me see how much. Okay, I'll give the kind of like second best answer. The best answer takes like 20 minutes. But so I come from this from the perspective of philosophy, and what philosophy gives you is the principles of clear thinking and moral action. And so one of the things philosophy does is it's the fundamental science that kind of integrates all of our knowledge and brings it together. And that becomes really valuable in debates about what we should do, because what you need is you need a set of standards that defines the goal we're trying to achieve, and then you need to be really clear as you think about the means of achieving it and not basically get taken in by a lot of the sloppy thinking methods that we're taught to adopt. And one of the most common ways that we're taught to think poorly about things is through what she mentioned, they're called package deals. So William F. Buckley, whom I'm not a fan of, but had this just great line about, you can't take a person who pushes an old lady out of the path of a speeding bus and equate it with a person who pushes an old lady into a speeding bus and say, oh, these guys like to push old ladies around. That's what a package deal does. It takes things that are fundamentally different and treats them as the same. And in the central concept in the inequality debate, oh, she's missing out on the answer. So the central concept in the inequality debate is economic inequality. And what gets packaged together, we talked about that, right? Is the person who creates inequality by creating wealth that other people gain through win-win, and the person who makes people worse by taking their money or exploiting them in some ways. And so if you're taught to think in terms of economic inequality, you can't think clearly about it because you're dealing with something that's packaging together these two things that need to be kept apart. Or take the concept of the rich. Anytime you find yourself using the concept of the rich, you need to be really clear that that better be shorthand, because the rich is not just grouping together people by money. It's actually implying that there's such a thing as economic classes with clashing interests. So the 1% have a shared interest, the rich have a shared interest, and it's at odds with the poor or the 99% or the have-nots. And that perspective is totally wrong. What is in common between a Bernie Madoff and a Steve Jobs? Like, you can't learn anything about Steve Jobs by studying Bernie Madoff. And so you just need to be, you always need to be on the lookout for these package deals. And again, they're all over the place. We talked about economic versus political power. That's the package deal of power. You're putting together a power that comes from offering rewards that people are free to reject versus one that comes from limiting people's options when they're not free to reject. It groups together the voluntary and the involuntary. And so that's why a philosophical perspective is going to be really important, because basically, look, the left's view is so implausible here. It's we're going to revive the American dream by taking a bunch of money from people who earned it and giving it to people who didn't, and then stopping them from earning so much in the first place. And now you're going to get a land of opportunity. That is not at all plausible. It's only plausible if you completely distort the issue, and they distort the issue all over the place. And so that's, and of course, equality packages together political and economic equality. And so if anybody tells you they're for equality, so the worst thing that free market people do is say, we're for liberty more than equality. No, do not grant the other side equality. You have to choose. Are you for political equality, or are you for economic equality? And if you're for economic equality, well, then you're against political equality. And yet it's political equality is the only thing that matters.
Great. Thank you very much.